Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Asia-Europe People's Forum and the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice webinar. Thank you for joining us. Good morning to those in Europe and good afternoon or evening to those who are joining us from Asia. So our webinar today is in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis, threats, opportunities, and imperatives for accelerating the fight for climate justice, just transition, and system change. That's a mouthful, but climate justice, all these fights are quite complicated, and we do say a mouthful every time we say something on climate justice. I will be co-facilitating this webinar. My name is Dorothy Guerrero. I'm head of policy with Global Justice Now, which is a member of the International Organizing Committee of the Asia-Europe People's Forum. We're also a member of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. Tabby, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Tabitha Spence. I go by Tabby, and I'm involved with the Asia-Europe People's Forum's Climate Justice Cluster and Food Sovereignty Cluster, as well as the communications team. Today, as Dottie was saying, we will be talking about the threats, opportunities, and imperatives for accelerating the fight for climate justice, just transition, and the system change that we all know that we need. I want to start by introducing our...
Not yet. First, Tabby, sorry. First, I want to, for those who are new and doesn't know us yet, well, the two co-organizers of this event, Asia-Europe People's Forum, it's an inter-regional network of progressive civil society organizations and social movements across Asia and Europe who are linked together and working in partnership on social and economic issues that concerns both regions since 1996. So it's probably one of the oldest network of networks out there. This webinar, as I mentioned, is co-organized by the Climate Justice and Just Transition Cluster, which is one of the 6 clusters within the AEPF. So for those who don't know us, you can visit our website, www.aepf.info, info. The other co-organizer, the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, is a network of networks as well, with hundreds of members that see climate change not only as a question of emission reduction in our physical environment. It is also working in various fronts of struggles because, well, we also view climate change as a political issue, an ethical issue, a social issue that also struggles politics, security, and the economy. Its wish is to realize a world in which the needs, interests, rights, and aspirations of peoples everywhere take priority over the profit of corporations and the excesses of elites. You probably know, for those who are working on climate, that many have this seeming understanding or thinking that since most countries around the world are now under lockdown to help stem the spread of the novel coronavirus, we must be fine when it comes to the atmosphere. Pollution is gone, blue skies, there's even fake news of dolphins in Venice. But given that huge consideration, we must come back to realization that the figures from forecasters show that the expected fall in emissions will just be more than 5% in 2020. That despite almost every country in the world now under lockdown. That would already be the greatest annual reduction on record. It would still be short of the numbers that are needed, or the percentage 7.6, if I remember it right, decline that scientists say is needed every year over the next decade to stop global temperatures from rising the 1.5 degrees Celsius or degrees centigrade. For highly industrialized developed countries, a double-digit decrease in emissions is actually needed. So if we remember, while we're discussing this, Shipping remains constant. Aviation is down by 40%, but still happening. Manufacturing has been slow to shut down, even if we say that only necessary items must be produced. There is a collapse in oil demand, but the International Energy Agency is still expecting a world to consume 76.1 billion millions of barrels every day. So we still have a lot to do, folks. So I will hand it over now to Tabi to briefly introduce our speakers, and then we start the first round.
Right. Thank you so much, Dottie, and thanks to all of the panelists for taking the time to be here with us today to share about your experiences over the last many years of being part of this struggle. I just want to briefly mention who is with us, and then we will give the full introduction before each person speaks. Before I introduce the names of the panelists, I briefly want to say something about the format of today's webinar. About the first half an hour, the speakers will each give us an overview of some of the points that they want to make regarding the questions of our time that we're engaging with. But we will have a chance for follow-up questions for about half an hour after that, and then another 45 or 50 minutes or so to actually take questions from the audience. So if you're watching this live, you can simply put your questions into the Q&A box below. Please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, for questions you want to direct to the speakers. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can also just put your questions in the comments. So today we have with us Mohsen Abdali from Pakistan, Molly Walsh, who's Brussels based, Vijay Krishna from India, and Asad Rehman from the UK, and Liddy Nikbit. I'm just going to start by introducing Mohsen now, and I will make the following, Dottie and I will make further introductions as we move forward. So Mohsen, it's actually a great pleasure and honor for me to be able to introduce Mohsen and just to know Mohsen Abdali, who is not only a student here at the University of Punjab of agricultural sciences, but he's come to be known as a leader in the community of Lahore amongst students, amongst farmers, amongst climate activists. He has really shined in the last several years. The photo that you're looking at on the screen right now is Mohsen giving a speech at the September 20th climate strike, which was an unprecedented event in Pakistan. There had never been any mass climate mobilizations until that day, when young people like Mohsen actually mobilized people in 26 different cities across this country. And there were thousands of people on the streets over the climate crisis and the need for urgent action, and specifically for climate justice. When I met Mohsen, he wasn't so active on climate. He was actually a student leader and working with labor. So I know one of the things he will talk about is his experience as a founding member of the Progressive Students Collective here in Lahore, which has chapters all across the country. He's also a founding member of the Agrarians and Environmentalist Collective, which started with students at PU, Punjab University, and it has become a member of the Pakistan Kisan Rabta Committee, which is the largest network of peasants across Pakistan, and it itself is a member of Libya Campesina. So Mohsen has been part of a lot of discussions and actually taking real leadership with labor, students, and climate youth and youth. So I just want to welcome you, Mohsen, and thank you for being here. You can unmute your mic.
Thanks for having me, comrade. I'll just start by the story of how Pakistani society and the state apparatus reacted to this pandemic, because it is an example of, I think it is an example of what has been done wrong to our world, and what are the things that needs to be eradicated from our world and human society. So when this pandemic started in Feb in China, so it was very obvious that it would, there was ambiguity that how much would it spread across the world, but it was obvious for Pakistan because we are a neighboring country, and Chinese are very much involved in our country in the CPEC projects. So it was very much, and many of our students were trapped in China who went to study there, and they were in the Wuhan province. So it was very much obvious for Pakistan that it would happen here. But the reaction of our government was very much ambiguous, and they were not willing to do a lockdown, even considering that this pandemic is such a huge thing. So the first case that was reported in Pakistan, it was in 26th February, and it took almost 1.5 months for our government to consider and apply lockdown here. So the first case started in 26 Feb, and the lockdown started at 1st April here in Pakistan. So it was a huge mess, and this was the trend that we saw in America that Trump was doing. So this is the crisis of leadership in our countries. But this when this started, so some of our governments took the initiative early, like the Sindh government, but our federal government and it rules in two more provinces, so they didn't apply it for a month. And then we had the clergy here, the religious people that were considering it as a conspiracy theory, and even they gave sermons, and they attacked police that was asking them to not offer prayers collectively and stop collecting gathering in mosques and other madrasa places. And then the Pakistani society, because the government was just saying that it's just some kind of flu, it is not dangerous as much as people are saying, as the West is saying. So our people are already, we have very low literacy rates, and people are not, most of our population is working class people, farmers, and they don't know much about the scientific and medical facts. So all the information that they were gathering was from the government institutions and their spokespersons. Even doctor communities was very much active in giving information about this pandemic and asking people to follow the SOPs and do as we ask. But the government and the people were very much indifferent to their calls, and there was a general inseriousness in Pakistani society. So after a month when the lockdown started, so in our country, 50% people still are food insecure. And many people live in the rural and small towns and cities. So when this lockdown started, it was a sudden lockdown, and there was no initiative from the government to protect the food needs and other medicinal requirements and other requirements that are needed to sustain life. So in Pakistan, about 73% labor force is from informal labor sector. They are daily wages. So their life is how that if they do not work for a day, they cannot eat for that day. So this is how their life works. So the rates, the payment of their work is already very low. And the scene is that if they do not work for some days, so they will be just starving in their communities, in their homes. So that's what happened after a week. A week and more than a week, people sustained this lockdown. But when it went for more than 2 weeks, so there was a general discontent, anger, and starvation. Our organization was distributing rations, or started distributing rations, considering how the situation was going in working class communities. So when we went there and we saw people how their lives were going, so it was literally miserable. Their immediate concern shifted from the pandemic to their food requirements and other immediate needs that people people need in their homes. This informal labor sectors was totally at the disposal of government of a Pakistani state, and there was no organized plan to protect their rights and to protect their livelihoods during this pandemic. And then after almost 2 months, government announced a package of 12,000 rupees for 3 months, which is nothing compared to the requirements and needs of people. And then in the formal labor sectors, the people that were doing in multinational and national industries, they were in here's the thing, that people are employed as contractual labor, not as a permanent workforce or labor. So those contractual labor that are almost 75% of the industrial workforce, so most of them were either fired out of their factories, they were just removed from the list of employees in those factories, or they were just kept aside with no pays wages from the factories. So they, after almost 2 to more than 2 weeks, they started protesting in front of those factories that we are your workers, we have been working here for more than for years, and now when the time has come that you need to support us, you are just disposing us to our instruments, so you are not caring about us. So, and then this the formal workforce, they were a very small sector, and the government employees, these were a very small sector of Pakistan that have their security of food and wages and other things. So and then the farmers in Pakistan, the most of these urban industrial neighborhoods function on the labor that has come from villages and other rural areas, because after the green revolution, there was a thing that the feudals started farming on large land masses. So those people that were pushed out of their lands, they started to migrate to urban centers, and in those urban centers they work now, and on them it is the most of that labor that on which the industrial sector of Pakistani society works. So these people, rendered jobless and homeless, went back to their rural and urban rural villages, and in there the due to the lockdown of the markets, the agrarian
Mhm.
markets, the
Those,
produce.
Comrade Mosin, those are really, really interesting. And I have a lot of questions concerning that. Thank you for telling us about the situation. But we will go back to that. And thank you for telling us the situation in your country under lockdown. And at the same time, it is good to know that despite the lockdown, despite all the difficulties, you and your organizations are still organizing, continuing your mobilization, and we would love to hear more of that later in the webinar. I would now like to shift to our second speaker. I wanted to remind everyone that for this portion, we will just have a 5 to 6 minute introduction of your top messages of all the speakers. And then later on, we have a more targeted questions to all of them. And of course, to give way as well to questions from our participants. And we want to make room for that because I know how frustrating it is to sit in webinars and not be able to speak or ask questions. So I want to remind everyone as well that while you're listening to the speaker, you can also put your questions or share them on the screen on the chat. And I'm looking at the Q&A. There's also a Q&A below your screen. You can click that and you can post the questions, and all our panelists will try to address that during the course of our webinar. I now want to go to our second speaker, Molly Walsh. Molly Walsh. She is from the Friends of the Earth Europe, based in Brussels, and she's a long-time campaigner on climate justice and energy, democracy, and she's been an expert on that and doing a lot of work on that aspect of climate justice. So now, Molly, tell us your top line messages.
Great. Thanks so much, Dottie. And I'm really honored to be part of this global discussion with so many inspiring activists. Um, I'll start by thinking back to March when the lockdown happened. And I was actually very hopeful at first. I was privileged enough that I could have the time to think and the time to have hope. Okay, my life changed completely. Some people in my family lost their jobs, but I'm not food insecure. Okay, so I was sitting at home with a lot more time. And I really asked myself, like, is this how our revolution comes? It's probably not going to be how we expect it. It might come in an unexpected form. And I think when something incredible happens, we need to ask ourselves, is this our revolution? And I thought everything changed. Economic concerns were put aside for reasons of solidarity. We were listening to scientific experts. Most countries were making decisions based on that, based on science and solidarity, which of course made me think about climate. But then reality started to creep in slowly. And so I'm going to talk about two big threats that I see. One is external, and that's nationalism. And one is internal to our movement. And I think I'll call it laziness, but I'll get to it in a minute. And of course, yeah, things shut down. The skies were no longer full of planes. And I was sitting to myself thinking, things that we said weren't possible became possible. And then I realized I'm probably not the only one sitting thinking that. The right, the far right, are probably sitting at their lunch table and thinking, oh, look, we closed all the borders. They said it wasn't possible. We just closed the borders. In a moment of crisis, everyone gets themselves home. Countries with the resources to get themselves their citizens home do it. And yeah, all borders are closed. You can't go from France to Germany anymore. So this is a battle for who has the best ideas lying around. And I think that the nation state, and I see that in a more dangerous light, it's won out of this crisis. People have very much been thinking in nationalist lines, like how many cases are there in Belgium? What's the UK's response? What's Sweden doing? Borders came down. You know, I was so happy at first that decisions had been made based on solidarity, but in Western countries, for us, that was solidarity with ourselves, with our mostly white people. And what about people who were trying to cross the Mediterranean? What about those Black and brown bodies, which have always been othered and which our mainstream society hasn't been in solidarity with? Of course, for them, decisions were not made to change everything. And yeah, I think this nationalism can also be a bit dangerous for our movements. There are a lot of exciting movements happening. If we think about Sanders, some of the things that those on the left of us we have been most excited by, are these internationalist left movements? A little bit, but not fundamentally, not enough. And when I listen to Moshin and when I listen to other speakers who talk about how this crisis is affecting the global South, I realize we really desperately need to have internationalist movements at this moment. And then I get to the laziness. I think everything changed, everything got really difficult. It becomes very difficult to hold meetings. It becomes very difficult to reach out to new people. And I think we're also in danger that we don't build the most important alliances and we don't build the difficult alliances anymore. So it's all very easy for me from Friends of the Earth to make an alliance with Greenpeace, but that's not system change. That's not going to get us the big change we need. And so I think about the alliances that we need to make with trade unions, that we need to make with labor, and that we as environmentalists, we need to recognize many of the mistakes that we've made that have made it difficult for labor to reach out to us when we talk about dirty jobs. We need to keep making those uncomfortable alliances, and we need to hold those comrades accountable. We need to be able to say to our allies in the labor union movement, are you really building power? Or are you just sitting on power that you had? Are you thinking of the worker as a revolutionary unit, as a white man? Is that all you're thinking about? Or can you also think about those who are more precarious, those who are more othered, women, people of color, migrants? And I know I'm coming to the end now. When I think about opportunities, I think we are in a little bit of a better chance than we were in 2008 in that financial crisis. You know, what the neoliberals were always very good at was having good ideas lying around. They developed the ideas, they talked about them, and they waited for the moment. And we've got a bit better at this now. The Green Deal is a good example. There's things to criticize and things to improve, but we have got some good ideas lying around. We've all read Shock Doctrine. We know what's coming now, and we need to start having our ideas, our vision, which should be big and broad, and we need to make it real. It's not just we want the world we want. We need to be really clear about what that means. And I can speak about that a little bit more, but I'll finish up now.
Thank you so much for that, Molly. We really look forward to going much deeper into a lot of the points you've raised. And with that, I'd like to introduce the next speaker. We have with us Dr. Vijay Krishna, who, let me just put his slide up here. Here we go. So you can see he's been very, very busy organizing large groups of peasants and labor, which he'll talk more about. But Dr. Vijay is from Kerala in India. He was the vice president and then president of JNU Students' Union. He also went on for a PhD in Indian agrarian economy at JNU with Dr. Utsa Patnaik. And today he's joint secretary of the All India Kisan Sabha. It's the largest organization of rural agricultural workers in India with over 16 million workers. It's also affiliated with one of the largest labor organizations in the world. And he is also a central committee member of the Communist Party India Marxist. And I want to thank you, Dr. Vijay, for taking this time to be with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this opportunity to come and speak to a wider audience across the globe. Actually, this pandemic, as far as we are concerned here, it has exposed the fragility of the neoliberal economic model like never before. And even in our case, like Mohsin was mentioning about Pakistan, the first case was in the end of January, but it took more than 2 months for the government to put its act together. And the 2-month period was spent on a divisive campaign along creating a communal divide, and also a mega event to invite Trump with almost 1 lakh. They claimed about 1 million participating in the program. But there are different models within India itself. You have the Kerala model, which has got a lot of acclaim. It has been acclaimed across the globe because it was in Kerala that the first case came up. And it has contained the pandemic to a great extent in an admirable manner. So, as far as opportunities are concerned, while we look at opportunities in the crisis to build greater solidarities, also the ruling classes are looking at it as opportunities for them to do certain things. In India, the think tank, Niti Aayog's CEO, Amitabh Kant, mentioned that this is an opportunity which will never come again. Catch it, hold it with both hands. And what are the things to be done? labor reforms. So the hard-won rights of the labor be done away with, land reforms be diluted, ensure corporates, big agribusinesses get easy access to the land of the peasants and dispossession of the peasantry. They can also take land on long lease from the peasantry. These are some things, and also market reforms where the private players, FDI as well as the big retailers would be able to directly buy from the farmers with no limits whatsoever, no restrictions whatsoever. So while certain countries like Spain have gone ahead to try and take the health system under the government's control, here you are having a different, it is more of neoliberal policies that is coming here. Clearly, this has its implications for the climate justice movement also. And because it's going to be much more intensive agriculture, corporatization of agriculture, that is going to happen. So that is depending on which side of the divide you are on, your opportunities, it's different. We have to see it that way. And Molly did mention about the need for much greater solidarity, international between different organizations across the globe. That is something which is required. In our country, we were looking forward to a bumper harvest in just when the lockdown was announced. There was about 11% increase in acreage of wheat. And but what happened with this is totally the workers were not allowed to involve with the harvesting activities. They could not run the harvesters. So today, in the first 21-day lockdown, the first phase of the lockdown, only 6% of the wheat that was sold in the same period last year has been sold this year, only 6%. So it is a situation wherein all sections, whether the farmers, the agriculture labor, the migrant workers, unorganized sector workers, all have lost their incomes. It's an income loss for everyone. So we have been demanding the income support, waivers of loans, and for the agriculture labor, at least unemployment wage of at least 300 rupees per day. But the central government has not, the BJP government, they have not agreed to any of it. Rather, they are giving huge concessions to the corporate sector. Today, they are talking about 12 hours of work a day. It is in 1886 that the Chicago martyrs demanded that 8 hours of work and 8 hours of leisure and no cut in pay. Now they are talking about 12 hours of work and 72 hours a week. That is what the corporate companies are pushing for. That is what the BJP government in India is also moving in that direction. So that is something which we are, and you have all witnessed how there is a exodus of millions of people, migrant workers, mostly from agrarian families, who are not able to fulfill their requirements with the meager earnings from agriculture. They come out in the lean season to work in other states, marching back thousands of kilometers. Already more than 600 people have died in this process, in accidents, of hunger, of heat strokes, and also committing suicide. India is a country with, from 91, you have the neoliberal economic policies being implemented. And from 95, according to official figure, 400,000 farmers have committed suicide because of distress. The number is much higher. I would say it must be close to 1 million, because women farmers, tenants, cultivators, and the tribal cultivators are not part of this list, and many of the states also fudge data. So this is the situation. So there is a situation wherein the struggle for climate justice cannot be mutually exclusive from the other struggles, socio-economic. We link up and like we mentioned, we are an organization of about 16 million members across the country. It is started in 1936, and we have a network across the country. we have been trying to promote agroecological approaches, pesticide-free cultivation, and so on. And largely, the membership is small landless cultivators, tenant farmers, small and marginal farmers, a good number of them not even having a hectare of land with them. That is the section that who are also going to be worst affected by the climate change. According to a study, a 2% increase in the temperature would lead to about 15 to 17% drop in production for wheat and paddy and rice in our country. So that is a situation. Unfortunately, nothing much is happening in that direction. It is more of the same policies which have led to this crisis are being pushed forward by this government. So what is required, and you see the government is also talking about social distancing. We have been saying it is not social distancing. What is required is to have a physical distance to ensure that disease is not spreading, but what is required is social solidarity. And that is a message which the Kerala Left Democratic Front government has given. It has ensured about 8.7 million people have been given food grains and also a kit with all essentials for a week, whatever is required for a family. It is giving for about 5.5 million people a social security. So today, I think the biggest thing is we have to bring into the agenda the issues like health, education, transport, and social security for all that require this, access to all who require this. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Viju, for highlighting that. And indeed, India is an example where you would see where government's priority lies, and you will see the difference. The case study you mentioned of Kerala, which this a state in northeastern tip of the subcontinent of India, you can see the government prioritizing life and health over the economy, and that's a very good example. And we have read and seen the news here of those millions of migrant workers that walk in desperation to go back to their villages since they lost their jobs in the cities. So our next speaker is someone who refused to put the climate justice in the back burner while the global pandemic is happening, and which is just the right approach. He is known for many years now as a voice for climate justice, for putting in the issue of the economy, of peace, of the issue of people of color that are being marginalized here in the UK and also globally. I want to introduce now Asad Rehman, who is the executive director of War on Want, and he used to work with the internet. He used to be head of international climate and campaign in Friends of the Earth. That's where we all first met him. Maybe he's also one of those who are arguing that when we talk of the Green New Deal, we have to talk about a global Green New Deal, because that's the only level where we could achieve what all the things that we wanted to happen to realize climate justice. So now, Asad, over to you.
Thank you, Dottie, and hi, comrades everywhere in the world. So I suppose my main reflections has been, I think we all recognize that the corona pandemic has just been the latest X-ray on all of our societies, right? It's exposed all the deep existing inequalities, racial, economic, gender inequalities. And I think it's important for us to recognize that this is not just as a result of decades of neoliberalism, but actually a much bigger issue in terms of centuries of historical exploitation that you can track from slavery, colonialism, right through all the different stages of capitalism. And I think that's important because sometimes people think that the only fight is some dialing back from neoliberalism to a world of Keynesian politics or economy. But that Keynesian politics and economy was also prefaced on the exploitation of the global south, of its resources and of its people. I think we see, of course, two different responses happening globally. We've seen in governments in rich countries, you know, on one hand, it has been quite incredible. This corona pandemic has literally thrown their economic rulebook out of the window. They've upended the decade of austerity, the argument that they made after the financial crisis. They've intervened directly into their economies. They've looked to control their markets. They've done a massive increase in public expenditure. They've created job retention schemes to avoid, of course, both this health crisis and to prevent what they felt was a complete collapse of their economies. Now, of course, that's been a mixed bag and in different places. And I would say in the UK, it's clear that the extent of the impact and the number of deaths here, which are probably the second highest in the world, as a result of a government that put the economy first before the health of its people and delayed any shutdown and any lockdown before it instigated those measures, and is weakening those restrictions at the very moment it's likely we're going to go from a first wave into a second wave of the corona pandemic. But interestingly, none of these measures have done anything to prevent actually even the widening inequality that exists in the rich countries. In fact, the corona pandemic has simply exposed all the other health and social inequalities. The UK, for example, had already 14 million people living in poverty, and of course, poverty relative to the UK, not in terms of the global south. But during the pandemic, food bank use has increased by 59%. We've seen BME deaths of the Black community 4 times that of the white community, and those are because of all the existing economic, social and health inequalities that exist. We've seen that those people who are in the low pay have not been protected by these job retention schemes. In fact, that they've racked up huge debts. People who are living in secure housing are increasing debt in terms of rent, in terms of employment. We've seen that the social protection schemes are not enough for people to be able to survive on. And of course, we've seen a very different experience between those that have had access to homes and green spaces and gardens and those that are locked into tiny homes with multi-generational occupancy in overcrowded housing, which is again one of the reasons why the Black community has been so adversely impacted. But despite all of this, I mean, we're now predicted in the UK that there'll be about 6.5 million job losses because of the corona pandemic. In the United States, the employment rate will be about 32%. They're estimating that's about 47 million jobs. And what's interesting in this moment, of course, is what have the governments been doing with their so-called stimulus package and protection of the economy? In fact, most of the money has been going to the big polluters. It's big airline companies, car makers companies, and chemical companies. Today, the government released some figures here in the UK. We've handed over 16.8 billion to 53 companies who are overwhelmingly the big polluters, and that the plans are to lend them another further 67 billion. So what we're seeing is actually an entrenching of the existing economic model and the existing corporations. Of course, for the global south, it's a totally different story, right? We know the decades of unfair trade rules, conditionalities imposed by the World Bank and has left no government in the global south the tools to control their own economies, to be able to meet the needs of, as we've just heard from Vijay, to control their own economies, to be able to provide basic services for their people. And of course, this is because of decades of privatization. But I think what is also interesting in this is when we look at the health, for example, and the exposure of that is how different it is both in the global north and the global south. So often, as Molly said, there's a bit of a competition in Europe where people look at other European countries. And we've seen Germany with 42 doctors per 10,000 people, the UK with 28, but of course, India with only 8, and then places like Sierra Leone with 0.2%. So your ability of a country in the global south, even if it actually wanted to be able to protect its citizens, is already being hampered. And we see the disparity between the number of countries without intensive care units. Those are the exact same countries. And when you overlay the inequalities, the climate impacts, and you overlay corona pandemic impacts, you see exact same correlation. It's the poorest, most vulnerable countries in terms of the global south that have been hit what I would call from the permanent crisis neoliberalism and climate and inequality have now had to add the corona pandemic. And of course, climate hasn't gone away, right? We already know, we can see what's happening. You see, look at the floods, whether it's happening in Kenya, you look at what's been happening with, of course, the cyclone that just recently hit Bangladesh and India. We've seen everything from the spread of locusts, and both through Africa and now in the Indian subcontinent as well. And this is, of course, based on an existing world where, you know, billions of people don't have access to, as we've heard, energy, to food, to health, where half the world lives on less than $5 a day. So I would say, you know, the main takeaway and the most concerning thing for us is you know, the response, as Molly said, to corona has been anything but global. Actually, what it's seen is a retreat to the nation state. We've seen competition for health services. We've seen disparities between Ecuador, where the dead lie unburied in the streets, and rich countries. We've seen, of course, you know, yes, on one level, the global north talks about that emissions have dropped, but that's because supply chains have been disrupted, which have left workers completely destitute in the global south. And Mohsin talked about that, and that's our experience with our partners. You can see from the garment workers where literally factory gates are being shut and people are just being left without any support. And of course, the worst is yet to come, because the global south has not yet really seen the first wave of the pandemic go through it. And of course, likely in the global north, it's already predicted we're going to head into a second wave of the pandemic. And when we look and dial forward, we can see the predictions that are coming. Half of all jobs in the global south will disappear because of the upcoming global recession. This is, of course, when we already know that 70% of all workers are in the informal economy and only 30%. So we can see that the economic damage that is going to be done is incredible. When the most conservative estimates from the global institutions are saying another 420 million people will be forced into extreme poverty, living on less than $1 a day, where they're talking about 30 years of any limited development gains being wiped out by this combining of these pandemics, I think that gives us a signal of the world that it's not going to be a better world at this moment. And I would just want to also make a couple of other small points. I mean, it's interesting, of course, that there is a paradox for the global south, because we've seen commodity prices collapse. In fact, they've collapsed by about 37%, which has meant there's about 800 billion hit to the global south, for whose economies overwhelmingly rely on that revenues because of how we've restructured their economies to rely on commodities. And so the paradox is demand is falling, so production, you either need to increase your production whilst your prices fall, but of course, increasing your production makes the prices fall. So the ability of the global south, even to be able to move away from that development model that was imposed on them, becomes even more difficult. And I think that's a real challenge in terms of for the global north and for the climate movement. The IMF says that the global south needs about 2.5 trillion simply to deal with this crisis. And as we've seen, very little is being forthcoming in terms of any transfer of finance, and even that to institutions like the IMF, which will of course add huge conditionalities to it. But what is interesting is the IMF says that 9 trillion has been spent on dealing with the corona pandemic. Now, when you calculate where that 9 trillion is being spent, you see that the 9 trillion is overwhelmingly being spent in the global north. And I think that also gives us a sign of what will happen in terms of the climate crisis. There will be money made available for adapting to the climate crisis. There will be money made available for transitioning, but it will be in the global north. And so the idea of sacrifice and of sacrificing the global south, which has been endemic and part of the why we are where we are in terms of the climate crisis, where we are in terms of the neoliberal and the global inequality crisis, and it's at the center of the logic of capitalism, is going to be supercharged. Have I got any minutes left, or have I got to shut up? No, okay.
You'll get some more minutes. We'll just take.
Sorry, I don't want to take that. Thank you.
You're making a lot of really important points, clearly, and I think the next speaker, Liddy, might elaborate further on some of those issues, particularly concerning the debt financing system that's creating all of these problems, which both, as you said, kind of entraps the global south in particular, but also debtor countries in the north, but also it creates an impossibility of ever paying back these loans and takes away any democratic rights that communities may have had. I want to welcome Lydie Nakpil as our next speaker. She has been active for well over a decade on the movement on debt and development and working to address the debt issues through Jubilee South. And as you can see, she's clearly been very active as a climate justice activist from the Philippines as well. She's part of the Philippines movement for climate justice, as well as the Asia Energy Network and the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, which is co-hosting today's webinar. She's also very active with the Asia European People's Forum. So thank you so much, Lydie. And
yes,
thank you.
I hope everyone can hear me. My internet gets spotty at this time of the day. First, I'd like to thank my co-panelists for really very articulately sharing with you and sharing with us a reflection on the situation that we have today and what has been happening. I will depart a little bit from that and talk more about what kind of tasks that we have as movements to face this situation, and maybe also in the process of talking about this task, add a little bit to what the situation is really like. I've prepared just a couple of slides just so that it's not a, just a straight talk and show you the main points that I've outlined. So I'm just going to do a screen share. There we go. So as part of movements, one of the most immediate things we always ask ourselves when faced with this kind of very dramatic situation, it's really unprecedented. Most people don't even experience this in their lifetime, this kind of global pandemic and economic crisis that is attendant or following in its wake. And we ask ourselves, what do we do? What are our tasks? And that is what I'm hoping to share today, as kind of also summarizing some of the key issues that we're facing. The first is that our movements face this very huge challenge of enabling and empowering ourselves and our communities to survive and deal with the impacts of the health pandemic and the economic crisis and the crisis response measures being promoted by our governments. We're not talking just in general about our people suffering. We're talking about our members, the members of our movements that are suffering these impacts. People and communities that we mobilize and work with and fight alongside with are facing this very, very grim situation of the lockdowns, the quarantines, the restriction of movements, inadequate healthcare. It's not just an inadequate response to the COVID-19 pandemic, but because the hospitals and clinics are so overwhelmed that even if you're sick with anything that's not related to COVID-19, you don't get the proper healthcare, let alone, be assisted in most other problems that your community and your families are facing. And as Vijay pointed out, one of the very dramatic impacts of this is the resulting loss of incomes and livelihoods and the resulting exacerbation of the hunger situation. So that, for instance, many of our movements in Asia, they don't have programs for relief as a regular thing, but we cannot help but respond to the situation and mobilize assistance in terms of food, in terms of medicines, to our very members and communities, and also, of course, to the broader communities that we are part of. So we need to do this, and many of our member movements have been doing this, and a lot of their time are right now just enabling their communities and their members to survive this situation. The second, of course, as very urgent, is to fight for more adequate and effective immediate responses to the health and economic crisis. We cannot simply take on the lack or the shortage from government responses to the health and economic needs. And we need to make these demands from governments and international financial institutions in the face of what is not only clearly inadequate, but the lack of political will to prioritize people's needs and community needs. And may I add, even in many countries, the lack of political will and the sheer incompetence of governments of the elites to do something about the situation, even in a country that is so modern and so state of the art like the United States, are the sheer incompetence of responding to the situation. And of course, Assad has mentioned also, of course, the decades of conditionalities which has left and the debt problem, which has left our public health systems in no way to even begin to rise to the challenge of what we're facing. But this demands for immediate responses also has to be accompanied with resistance to measures that they are doing, which actually exacerbate our suffering. They're not only responding in an adequate way, they're making it worse for us. They exacerbate people's suffering, they deepen inequality that we already have to contend with, and they further entrench elite and corporate power and agendas. One of our colleagues in APMDD, Charles, also a leader in AEPF and DCJ, just sent a WhatsApp message, and there's some news that billionaires have made almost $600 more billion during the period of COVID-19. So of course, we're not all suffering. Some are actually raking in more profits from people's miseries at this time. And this resistance also includes stopping repressive governments and right-wing efforts to use the crisis to escalate authoritarianism and expand military and police powers. Just the other day, the Philippine Congress passed the anti-terrorism bill, which is going to make life in the Philippines even more difficult in terms of political space, in terms of the behavior and the actions of police and military. And this practically suspends many of our civil and political rights. We should also oppose policies that will undermine what are already inadequate climate targets and set us back even further away from the goal of keeping global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees and preventing climate catastrophe. And that includes this bailouts of fossil fuel corporations. They're simply going to extend the life of these corporations and postpone the end to fossil fuel energy. A third point is we also have this imperative to rise to the challenge and opportunity that these unprecedented circumstances have generated so that we can fight for a reboot, a reset, a rebuilding of the global economy and national economies towards a completely different order, a just, equitable, resilient, post-carbon, sustainable, and should I say non-capitalist new order. And we, in fact, have been very conscious about avoiding the word recovery, because that's what many governments and corporations have been talking about, economic recovery, because we do not want to simply go back to what we had before COVID-19 and this economic crisis. We want this to be an opportunity to shift completely towards a different direction, a real system change. And that means we need to reshape the public discourse on economic recovery to be active about, for instance, what Assad was talking about, a Green New Deal, a global one that really also incorporates visions and demands and realities of people in the South. We need to challenge stimulus packages, bailout programs, and other economic measures being announced by governments, the very inadequate debt relief measures announced by the G20 and the IMF, and we need to fight for very concrete, immediate, and medium-term changes towards system change. We cannot just articulate analysis and visions. We need to have concrete fights, and we need to win these fights. We need to carry out the fights with the objective of winning not system change immediately, of course, but we need to win victories that will bring us closer to that. And then finally, on my fourth point, the challenge is really working out how we can pursue even more vigorously and intensely the building of our movements and the waging of our various struggles to shift the balance of forces and win these victories we are talking about under these new conditions. Under these new conditions, we need to adapt new and effective organizational arrangements and ways of working. We've been forced to do that, but we need to do this more purposively so that we can become even more effective under these new conditions. We have to redefine the objectives, narratives, strategies, and tactics of our campaigns. And we need to aim for major breakthroughs. No, we can't just aim for shifting and adjusting so that we can do and attain the same objectives, but just under, a different set of conditions. We must aim for breakthroughs, not just in using new and effective forms, but also in reclaiming and recovering the ability to engage in actions. The Philippines is still under a general community quarantine, but we are inspired because just yesterday, we had more than 1,000 people mobilized, keeping social distancing, but, accomplishing that, which for us, maybe few weeks ago, we didn't think would be possible until next year, maybe. But people have been brave and people have been daring, and now all the rest of us are very much inspired. So just, I guess the last is to show this slide from the DCJ, Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, that is really calling us for unprecedented mobilizations and unprecedented people's collective actions to meet this unprecedented situation, because we are not going to be able to change the system if we just continue on the way that we have been doing, or to be satisfied with victories, but not really in the scale that is needed, not in the speed that is needed. And we need to have, that kind of determination to have breakthroughs and to scale up and to speed up our efforts, despite or probably especially because of these new conditions. Thank you, and I hope I didn't go beyond my time.
Well, you did actually, but that's excellent anyway, because what you presented dovetail to the follow-up part of this discussion. I wanted to remind the speakers again that please follow your allocated time. I know you've been saying a lot of wonderful things, but we also wanted our participants to have the chance to say something as well at the end. So for this part, so all the speakers have mentioned their experiences under lockdown, how they are facing the challenges, and how their movements are addressing the challenges of the lockdown. Molly, I think everyone, Assad, Lidi, Mohsin, and Viju have mentioned that it is now also time to discuss about what strategies would work. It has been mentioned over and over that at this moment, it's both a struggle for ideas, it's a struggle for strategies, and Lidi indeed point to us what those challenges are. But I would like to ask all of you that we have made and presented all these wonderful blueprints of how we wanted to change the situation, where we wanted to go, and what we wanted to happen. When this COVID-19, with this challenging period is over, we're back to the struggle to make a sustainable world. So now that we have those blueprints, we have seen in the US and here in the UK, Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn had great ideas. Both parties have great opportunities. All our movements are presenting this is what must happen. We have good analysis, but it's not winning. And when it comes to people getting power and parties, progressive parties getting power. So from our movements, now that we have presented the blueprints, how do we present the strategies? How do we push our agenda and make people pause and say, that's right, that's what we need to do. And we're all with you together on that. So can we give 2 minutes for all of you to respond to that quickly? And there are follow-up questions after that. Can I reverse the order now? Maybe since Lydie made the challenges, 2 minutes. I will cut your mic if you if you go over that. So Lydie, 2 minutes, followed by Assad, and then Viju, Molly, and Mosin.
So actually, because I took a lot of time talking about those challenges and those tasks, I'd really like to share more of the time to my co-panelists.
Okay.
But what I really I think is very important today is we need to be very fast in keeping up with the trends and the changes, because every day there's new changes, both either in the economic front or new laws and new measures being implemented by governments. And so it's a bit difficult to be catching up and to be keeping posted on all of this, but I think it's very important that we do that, because we also, our plans and also our responses need to be fluid. And let's take this opportunity to be global in our responses, not just focused on our particular communities and our countries, because there is a lot of commonality across countries, and we have the technology to be able to communicate with each other and make sure that we have common global responses.
Assad.
So I first wanted to maybe just say there are huge opportunities as well. So we gave a lot about what is the problem and all of those. I mean, even if we look at, for example, the Black Lives Matter movements, that spread across both in the US and in many countries in terms of the global north. I mean, what we see there, I think, is something very interesting, is people looking at race and of course, but thinking and leading to actually a deeper questioning about what the race, economy, and systems of oppression. And I think there's something also very important for us as a movement, because when you look at the people who are out on the streets, overwhelmingly young, many of those people out on the streets on the Black Lives Matter protests were exactly the same young people who were on the streets on climate and were taking the message about climate justice. So our ability to be able to build power in that sense, I think there is more of an opportunity than we have seen for a long time. Because of course, one of the key demands, quite rightly, from the movements in the global south was, so where is the movement on the streets in the global north that we can build collective power with? And of course, that's changed a little in the last couple of years as we've seen various iterations of climate justice groups come out on the street. But I think there is now this an opportunity, a window that exists in there. And there's also an opportunity, because even in the worst bits of the corona pandemic, as Molly said, there's also been this idea of community solidarity, of mutual aid, of people looking at their own communities and saying, how do we help? So there is the we that is rebuilding, and I think that's absolutely important. The most important thing that we've got to do, we've got to have a coherent narrative. A narrative that links climate, corona, inequality, racialized capitalism, and historical exploitation. If we don't have that intellectual framework, we've already lost, because we will be forced into a silo of trying to fight one fight separate from the other fight. We have to use this opportunity to also deepen people's political understanding and education. There has been a lack of political education, particularly in the global north, for a great number of years. So what we've seen is a lot of anger and energy now, but that needs to be rooted and learned, and the lessons learned of how and why have our movements failed in the past. Often, and we have to accept this as criticism between ourselves. One, it was our slogan, whatever, 20 years ago, one no, many yeses. The problem we have too many yeses, right? So how do we combine those to say, for a right to everybody to have a dignified life, what is that transformational agenda that centers the global south, that guarantees people that? So we have to, I think, talk and say, we have to do a demand around inequality, which are guaranteed basic income, full universal public services, social protection, and workers' rights, that take that cornerstone, bring the labor movement, but also connect with where our movements are in the global south. We've got to talk about climate and embed a 1.5 and fair shares analysis. I mean, it's interesting that even today, the businesses and the government is talking about, of course, net zero 2050. But big NGOs are still talking about the UK being at net zero 2045. That is a death sentence for the global south. That is busting the 2-degree target. For the UK, that means we should be at zero, not net, at zero by 2030, and to give a transfer of at least £1 trillion just to meet the UK's own fair share thing. We have to talk about reclaiming the commons, energy and food as public goods. And we have to think about how do we connect the just recovery to remodel trade and finance regimes. And I just want to end, and of course, one of the important fights has been about debt, but we've got to move that conversation from debt to reparations. Without that, the global south will never have the tools to be able to say and to be able to address the conditionalities that are being imposed on it by the global north. I'll shut up.
So, taking off from what Liddy and Asad already mentioned, I think even in our own country, we have been having protests during the lockdown also. On 21st April, we had about 1 million people taking part in a protest at their doorsteps. That is trade unions, peasant organizations, agriculture labor organizations, and organizations of the most oppressed sections. So this is a new kind of solidarity that is strengthening over the last few years. Over the last 5 years, we have tried to build issue-based unity, one against land acquisition, corporate takeover of land, for land rights, another for remunerative price for crops and freedom from indebtedness. And these experiences have taught us that at least we need to unite around a certain agenda. We may not agree on everything, but the most important issues, there is need to build an issue-based unity. I think that alternative has to be put forward, including issues like climate justice and other issues which Asad also was mentioning about how universal access to food, health, education, transport, and social security. These should be an alternative that around which we can build the broadest possible unity of all oppressed, whether the working class, the peasantry, the indigenous people or tribals, the in a country like ours, the most oppressed Dalit sections. And it is very, you see the kind of protests that have been happening against racism in America and other countries. I think that also provides hope, and that the future is not so bleak. People are willing to come out on the streets, and the issue of this distancing and work from home is only possible for a small elite section. In our country, the migrants who have been walking back home, there is no distancing possible for them. The poor housing that is there is no possibility of any distancing in those houses. So issue of housing, all these in a sustainable manner, that is something which we need to build a unity around that. In our country, we are making that effort. I think it is not, and even helping out in terms of providing food for the hungry. It is something which just our organizations cannot handle. The magnitude of the problem is humongous. The governments have to do it. So there is need for putting that pressure. I think that's it.
Yeah, Molly?
Yeah.
Molly?
Thanks. So what should our strategies now be? Unfortunately, there are no shortcuts and there are no silver bullets. I don't think this crisis provides us with them. We have to use the tools that we've always had in our toolbox. Unfortunately, they work, but they're hard. They're hard work. It takes time and energy. We have to tell stories. We have to build that collective narrative. We have to build that collective we that includes us all, a collective we that's internationalist. We need to do the hard work to map power in our communities, in our workplaces, To build power in those communities and workplaces, we need to do political education within the relationships that we build. We need to start where people are politically and take them on the journey that we've had the privilege to go on. And I don't just mean sharing books or podcasts, although that can be nice. I mean the political education that comes by being in struggle together, that comes by being on a picket line with someone, that comes by protesting police violence with your neighbors. That's what we have to do. There's also no perfect opportunities, right? And if we wait for one, we'll let them all go by. So this stimulus package, it is an opportunity. They always told us there wasn't enough money to change our economies. There wasn't enough money to tackle climate change. They always talked about the cost of climate action. But suddenly states have found ways to find billions of euro. And those of us that are lucky enough to live in states where they are finding that money, we need to use those stimulus packages. We need to make sure that the just transition is funded. We may need to make sure that there are reparations, that it's a global Green Deal. We need to talk about funding for the energy transition that's owned by people, that's owned by communities. And when we look for other opportunities, maybe the Black Lives Matter movement and this incredible uprising across the US and also in European cities, maybe this is a start of the conversation that we need to have. This global reckoning on race, on privilege, on white supremacy, that those of us that privilege from it need to do the work to overcome. Because it's not about police brutality, just about police brutality that allows the killing of people of color. It's about something deeper than that. It's about the othering and the sacrifice of Black and brown bodies, which has allowed everything. It's allowed colonialism, it's allowed slavery, and it's allowed climate injustice because it was always people somewhere else who was being killed and who were being sacrificed. So it's not the perfect opportunities, but we got to take them and we got to build them, and we got to build those international movements together.
As per the ideas that envision how the world must work, so in this time, the crisis of the system is not new. When the center broke in previous few years, there has been a rise of neoliberal and fascist forces in most parts of the world, here in Pakistan, in India, in America. So the people are going through their regimes and they are following and suffering of their policies. So I think, and they are fighting it on different fronts. In our country, health workers, students, labor, farmers, and women, and all the other sections of society are fighting with their issues firsthand, and they are committed to fight. And there are chances and happening that they're forming collective platforms to have a united front against the onslaught of this neoliberalism. So I think it's time, I agree with my co-panelists, that it's time to further harden our narrative. We cannot do the mild reformist strategies and narrative, because this is the politics that we have been doing after the 80s. So it's time to have a revolutionary narrative and to guide the people, because critique and the problems in this system is everything that people are saying and they're talking about. So we need to give a proper narrative and form to their anger, and also suggest that we need to form an international front alliance to fight the international imperialism that has been
Is it just me or did we lose
Mohsen?
Mohsen?
has been impacted.
Mohsen, can you just repeat your last 20 seconds?
Okay, I'll do that. I'm saying that we need to form an international alliance to fight the international and institutional imperialism that we have been suffering in our third world, in our countries, because IMF was never more impactful in our country than it is now. It is forming policies, it is forming our budgets. So we need to fight it in this front, and the debt thing is the most important, because our economies and the excuse of our governments to govern us this way is that we have to pay our debt debts, we don't have enough money to spend publicly. So that thing is the most important and most wanting thing that the third world wants from the global north. Thank you.
Thanks so much for all of your very important responses. There are a lot of questions that have come in the chat, so I'm going to sort of pose sort of an amalgamation of those questions together in response to some of the things that you've been saying now. Farooq Tariq referred to what just happened to the Pakistan steel mills yesterday, where 9,000 plus workers were laid off in a day, and the IMF is pushing the privatization of the entire industry. He gave that example, and I want to link it to some of these other questions of both internationalism and what can be done on the ground in the cases where we're seeing mass layoffs, you know, across the global south in particular, but also around the world. And I think, I wonder if we can talk, if each of the panelists can talk a little bit about the question of scale, because Viju, you talked a bit about the case of Kerala and how Kerala has been managing the COVID-19 crisis, but also working to address a lot of broader social issues. And that is a very localized case, but of course, Kerala, just like everywhere, can't separate itself entirely from this imperialist and capitalist global economy. And so I'm wondering if we can think about from the grassroots, when, you know, when thousands of people are laid off, when farmers aren't able to get to market and are suffering for a lot of other reasons, like the locust swarms across the region, like the climate impacts, the suicides related to debt, which Viju spoke about, and how can we support each other in building networks of mutual aid from the grassroots up and strengthening our capacities at the grassroots level, particularly when it comes to jobs and social security, and then relating that to this global level where we know that the international financial institutions, you know, have a lot of power in terms of dictating policies across the global south, even the south of Europe as well. But so I kind of want to push a bit harder from where Mohsen was sort of taking us on the question of what kind of international collaborations we can make or should we join, maybe that are already being discussed, like a global Green New Deal. And what would that look like both from the grassroots level and from the top down? Consider both jobs and debt. So if everyone can take 2 minutes, we can go back in the forward to reverse order again, if that's okay with you, Mohsen, if you'll start, and then we'll continue in the same order as earlier. Thank you.
Sorry, I can't hear the question well. Can someone else start and then I'll just add to it after considering the discussion.
Sure, I'll also repeat the question, but if anyone else is ready to start. I was just kind of talking about the question of scale, because we're organizing in our own localities, we're responding to the crises, you know, that are affecting, you know, us wherever we are, and standing in solidarity with people carrying out the struggles that they're part of. But we also know that the crisis is global. So we need to globalize this struggle. We need to both strengthen our movements on the ground, as Molly was talking about, and also, as she was saying, like link it to an international struggle. And we were all talking about this a bit. So I was just wondering if we can go deeper into that, that dialogue. Maybe, is it anyone ready? Anyone else ready to start? Or Mohsen, would you like, Liddy?
I can say something. Yeah, I think there are we have been internationalizing this struggle for a while now. So I think we can draw some important lessons from what we have been doing in recent years, but also try to reimagine how to do this because we're facing new conditions. So I think one very important element of that, how to internationalize, is something that Assad has already mentioned, and that is we need a very effective and coherent narrative, and we need a narrative that is common for all of us globally. I mean, it's very, very good because it makes it very concrete that in an international setting, we talk about our country situations, but we also need to be able to go beyond talking about our country and talk about the common issues that peoples everywhere face across borders, and to strive to have that common narrative so that when we engage our common adversaries and when we address the public and the media, people can see that we are united with our analysis, with our demands and our narratives. That's extremely important. The second is in our campaign tactics and strategies, it's also important to identify common targets and similar or common arenas where we can fight together, because we want to take the fight globally. We want to face many adversaries that operate in a global way. So we need to identify who they are, how do we engage them in the arenas that we can all share. So not just in our parliaments and our streets, but also in the arenas globally. And right now, a lot of those arenas are online. So I mean, there's no meetings and so on, but they are still taking place. For instance, the IMF, World Bank, because the IMF has been mentioned by our speakers, they will have their annual meetings in the scheduled time, but most likely online. We need to prepare for that so that during that time, in the weeks leading up to it, and during those moments, we are all articulating our demands and mounting coordinated actions. So the these are what we have been doing, and we need to explore and discover how to do this effectively under this new situation where our physical movements are curtailed. But I've been so inspired by the recent action in the Philippines. I think we need to aim for actual mobilizations face to face earlier than we thought, and just make sure there's social distancing. So it's going to be more cumbersome and going to be expensive to travel. Right now we still don't have public transport, so it's going to take some resources, but we need to break through. You have to make these kinds of breakthroughs.
Viju?
See, I think what Liddy already mentioned, I did refer to the experiences that we had here, the unities that we have built, issue-based unities that we have built. Initially, though, it started on around one or two issues. In the course of the struggle over the last 4 or 5 years, we have been able to arrive at a consensus on a much wider issue, a range of issues. That is something which is within our own countries what is required, but also outside, how to link with the other organizations which are having similar ideas and willing to work together. That I think we need to get to know, all of us need to get to know each other better, how we can take forward this struggle. So some platform is required for that, and surely struggles are going on. Here, what we have been telling is physical distancing and social solidarity. That other than that, you need to have an international solidarity that can be built. I think there are different, you have the trade unions have a federation across the globe, which are raising issues. You have organizations of farmers who are having, so linking these together, if we can address that, the present concerns, it would be good.
Shall I go or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Please do.
Yeah, I think this, some of the answers I want to come up with are really old, you know, like think globally and act locally. Like I still don't think there's any silver bullet. And yeah, it's about telling those stories with a collective we, and as someone was saying, um, outlining who our enemies are and who we should be united against. But it's also about telling slightly different stories, right? Because what we need to reckon with in the global north is our, what we could say, imperial mode of living, which is that so much of our comfort and our material wealth is based on the exploitation of people and nature in other parts of the world. So working together to reveal that and to make sure that that's a truth that is no longer hidden, that's part of what we have to do. And I mean, this, when you talk about jobs, this kind of shocking statistic that half of people in the global south are going to lose their jobs, I think that's not part of the narrative yet. People are too focused and too blinkered on their own city and their own street, and revealing that is something we need to do. But of course, it's not about the recovery, because what were those jobs? So jobs in a garment factory to make cheap fashion for us in the West. So yeah, it's not about going back, but it's about imagining together a better world. And when we imagine a system change or a changed system, I think we're okay at imagining the final destination, right? That utopia where, yeah, we have a lot of nice communities and everybody lives within nature's limits. But like Lydia was saying, we also need to think about how we're getting there. We need to spend the time and energy imagining our paths to system change, because we don't know yet which one we're going to take. We might have to take many of them. So yeah, it's about the in-between demands where we really lack.
Wilson?
Yeah. First, I think these are the platforms that we need to build more strongly to strengthen the international solidarity. We are contacting Progressive International and other organizations that have ideological and political narratives like us, and trying to engage with them over the issues. And further, as Molly was saying, that although we need to discuss more deeply that how this system can be changed and what are the ideas that we must endorse and bring forward. But then the other thing is that there are some very apparent perspectives and institutions that are impacting the global politics and global economics, like IMF, World Bank. So we need to form the alliances to fight their influence wherever they have their influence. And then there are treaties, like as we have Indus Water Treaty in our country, that is an international agreement, but it is hindering our water resources, and it is deteriorating many of our land in Pakistan due to the dams that have been constructed upon the Indus and other river channels. So I think these international issues and international institutions whose influence and impacts are very clear, we need to start from them immediately. And then we can further deepen our conversations about how we can imagine a collective systematic change. And we need to overthrow from the minds of the people the influence of the corporations, that the world can function without these corporations. It is functioning now. And in the crisis, these corporations and this state apparatus wouldn't work. Maybe it be now or in the future.
Yeah, so thanks for that. So that's our round. We have roughly 15 minutes. Assad, sorry. Yeah,
Assad
go
did.
on, please.
Sorry, I'll be very, very brief. So, I mean, we talked a bit about, you know, the need for a global Green New Deal. I just want to say, so War on One with other partners, we've actually doing a lot of work on what would a radical global Green New Deal look like. Initially, the idea was, you know, to have big face-to-face discussions, bring our movements from the global north and the global south, the thinkers and the policy people, so we could develop this conversation. Obviously, we now had to rethink that and think about how do we move to a digital roundtables, but even then recognize all of the barriers and the inequities of who has access to be able to sit on Zoom calls and who doesn't, and what does that mean in terms of language and different contexts, etc. But I think we all recognize we need a global intellectual framework. We need to be able to agree some policy transformations. We need to think critically about the next 18 months. If we think about that, we're in 3 stages, right? There's been this critical relief stage where a lot of our movements have been forced into providing the necessary humanitarian relief just to their own communities to prevent abject sort of destruction to their lives. We're going to be in a stage of recovery. What that recovery is, of course, is up for grabs and it's a fight. And we have to think about the reimagination of how do we dial forward? If we look back at the WTO, that last moment where I would say genuinely we've had a global movement coming together in the sense of all of our sectors, that's because there's been a global issue. I think one of the challenges of climate was it was still never global in the sense that the North was never impacted like the global South, right? It's only slowly started to happen, and even then the inequities are very, very clear. But we know, as Lydia and others have said, we've got the IMF and the World Bank, we've got the G7 and G20, and we've got the COP26. We've got 18 months for a huge fight because already the corporations are taking our language. They're talking about Green New Deals, green stimuluses, green recovery, Build Back Better. They are populating it with their framework. The right is actually more internationalist than we are. We have to accept that. We have retreated into nations, into silos, into thematic fights, rather than actually thinking about bringing that together. And that brings a big question about what does building power look like? And I absolutely agree with Liddy and with Molly and others that building power also requires us to have fights, right? And of course, how do you do this within the corona pandemic? How do you do it across borders? And how do we make sure we embed internationalism? Because for me, the big concern is internationalism is already going, even amongst what I would call mainstream civil society organizations. So the demands are nation specific, and then I said add-on demand about something about the South, rather than starting from how do we guarantee everybody in the world X, and then what would be the demands that we need to be able to make across the board. I also want to give us a note of caution, because we have to look at the lessons of 10 years ago on austerity, right? Now, in austerity, people were exhausted as well, right? And there is a real danger that after this pandemic, people are so exhausted, they simply say, whatever the state does to protect whatever we've got is better than anything you can imagine forward. So we have to turn our rhetorical reimagination into something that people actually can see themselves into, which really does mean that connecting from the abstract language into real concrete demands. And I think what Vijay was saying about, building unities on issues, on issue base, creates unities across on a broader political analysis is absolutely the right way to do about it. So that's what we're going to be doing as Global Green New Deal, and many of you are already involved in that conversation. That conversation, I think, is a really necessary one, and I can separately send you some more details about how in the coming weeks and months we can all collectively work together on that. I do want to say just one final thing. When we say that the right are international, if you look at disaster capitalism, and the rise of the right wing and authoritarianism, this retreat to the walls and fences, we talk about it as being just over there on the right, but actually even in amongst our own movements, there is this pathology. I mean, we saw it even in the midst of the corona pandemic, where people were saying nature is recovering. Look how amazing the pandemic lockdown is, and sharing pictures of boars and deers and ducks in global north, whilst the poor are dying on the streets in the global south. How you bring back this idea that we, I think, is the most important challenge that we collectively face. And of course, there's not one single bullet in it, but there is a lot of lessons that we have had before. I always say, not a single trade union banner in the world does it say workers of you know, Britain unite. It says workers of the world unite. And I think that's our challenge. How do we bring class back into this conversation to be able to bring and build real unities?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Asad. I think that's a very important point, to bring back class in the narrative, in the discussion, in the question, and in the struggle, in the resistance as well. And I think I will have this last round where you will respond in 1 minute only, please. And because we have an important question coming from our Facebook streaming, and this I think will link very well with Lily's point as well. And most of you have mentioned, how do we rebuild? How do we reset? What do we want it to see after after the pandemic? How do we build? How do we see that next world after the pandemic? And it doesn't come out magical in a magical way, that because we had the crisis, people wanted to do, we still need levers to make that happen. So how do we rebuild that new economy in response to the crisis, and transition from that defensive struggles to a more proactive ones? We're facing job cuts. We're facing at the same time some governments doing things that they will not usually do. So in that sense as well, there is radicalization also happening in the demands from movements, because as we see, there are a lot of things that governments are doing. They should do more, of course. So how do we focus on that? And that will be also your closing part as well. So 1 minute each. Can I ask Mohsin to start now, and then we do that route?
I think as the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements that we are seeing, it's just an impetus to explode the public anger that they have been building over the years, and specifically during this time of pandemic. So people will react to this, and specifically in countries like us. It is not possible to sustain their lives. So if this crisis continues, this anger will explode in some kind. May it be like Arab Spring or the incidents like that, but it will explode. So we need to form platforms and our narratives to give direction to this anger. So we have to be prepared for it right now, because if it prolongs, then this anger will be destructive. So we must be prepared to give direction and give shape to this public anger, and to form it in some concrete institutions and structures. Yeah. So that's what I say.
Thank you. Molly?
Yeah, so I go back to the story again. As I said, we need a global intellectual framework. Yeah, that's another way of saying a story, right? So we need a story and a narrative that works in spaces like this, where we have the privilege to speak globally, where we have the privilege to recognize each other as comrades across the world. And here we can develop the values that we need in that story. But we also need to road test it in our communities, in all of our communities. I don't just mean in the global north, because fascism is rising everywhere. So if my nice story about Black Lives Mattering doesn't work with my neighbors, I need to test it with them, and I need to find a new way to say it. I need the courage to stick to my values of equality and rights and justice, but I also need the practice of speaking to people politically where they're at. And that's the hard work that we have to do, but being more local and being more community-based has had a moment now. And yeah, that's where I think we should be putting a lot of our energy.
Dottie, you're muted. Is it Viju next?
Yeah, Vijay, sorry.
In terms of building solidarity, usually our struggles in India also when the farmers would be on the struggle path, it would be only them and few fraternal organizations of trade unions expressing solidarity. But post the Kisan Long March, we found that a broader solidarity was building up. For instance, you had a nationwide solidarity called Nation for Farmers, and with writers for farmers, teachers for farmers, students for farmers, these kind of different solidarity groups emerging. And before the All India struggle we already had a wide cross section of society coming forward in support of the farmers. And we could ensure through that struggle that the farmers' issues and the agrarian crisis came on to the national agenda, which none of the political parties could actually ignore. And here also now, when we are talking about an alternative and building a solidarity of all oppressed, with class oppression as well as caste oppression, racial oppression, bringing a unity of all of them around this alternative. And here what Molly mentioned is very important, how we can put it across in a very cohesive manner and a very simple manner, so that those who are still not part of the struggle are also in it is possible to also enlist them in this struggle. That is I think the challenge that we have.
Yeah, thank you, Vijay. Asad, your last word.
Sorry. Oh, I was trying to unmute my mute there when I realized I won. I absolutely agree with Molly, about vision in the story. We have to recognize that when we're talking about power, for too long we've been building defensive power, right? To what stop building offensive power in terms of what we want. That's a transformative vision. Does take different challenges, and it's important. But the positive is, I think there is possibility of more unity, because when we look at the crisis and how it's even affected the global north, the large sections of people plunged into poverty, into low pay, our narratives must tell stories that are not, this is either you or that, but an and. So rather than separate the international to the domestic, they become, if we want to demand public services in our own countries, we should be saying, public services here and globally. We should be saying, living wage here and globally. So not pitting our own parts of our most vulnerable communities as if there is a fight about this piece of the pie. We actually have to be talking about how do we reallocate bigger resources. I mean, it's said that Corona is the virus, but the reality, I think, for more people is race, capital, and climate is what's killing them, right? And so, and to be able to tell a story that solidarity is the answer, I think is really, really important. And I just make one aside. I think for a long time, a lot of progressive movements have had an ambivalent attitude to the state at best, but the requirement of the state is become more and more important. So our relationship to the state is also one that we've got to really unpack. When we talk about transforming the state, what does that mean? I think for a long time, people have thought you ignore the state. Actually, the right has always understood you capture the state and you transform society at the same time. And we have to be able to think about that strategy collectively.
Okay, thank you, Asad. Libby?
Yeah, I'd like to say that it's also very important to build solidarity in the course of waging our common fights. And I have a few, 3 or 4 fights that I think we need to unite on. The first is a fight to shift public resources away from debt payments, so stop paying debt, to shift it away from subsidies of fossil fuels so that we have enough public resources to rebuild our essential services, to address the pandemic, and also to start rebooting the economy away from the current system. The second area is we need to have job creation, not to bail out corporations, but to create jobs and livelihoods for workers. So we're talking about climate jobs, jobs in climate programs. We're talking about jobs in essential services, rebuilding our health systems, our educational systems, and so on. And then we need to build jobs in the course of shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable energy and in ecological restoration. Tove reminded us about ecological restoration in the chat. Then the last is we need to prioritize food production for domestic consumption. This is a message for all of us in the South. Our economies are producing food, but not for our people. And we need to address that challenge very immediately because the economic crisis and the climate crisis is really creating and widespread hunger. And we need to address that. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Libby. I don't have that 5 minutes to do the synthesis, so I will just do a very, very quick highlight the points that all of you have mentioned. What really struck me strongly is that we have proven, movements have proven that we are flexible and light in our feet in shifting to do a combination of practical actions to address the pandemic, and at the same time continue our pressure, continue our struggle, continue telling the narratives and our demands for climate justice. What we see now as well is that the resistance is continuing. The one in the US, which is happening 24/7 in our TV screens, might be the most prominent now, but there is continuing, or there are continuing resistance in many communities that are fighting transnational corporations who are prying in their territories and insisting on extractivism. Those are also happening. We have shown that our movements are defying lockdown and finding creative ways to resist, and that we all are asking the bigger question now to ourselves, and also inviting the general public in building a bigger we. So what do we mean by that bigger we? How do we build that bigger we? And at the same time, questioning capitalism, questioning the climate frying development model that we accept in the past seems to be untenable now. So I think at this point, we have a bigger space to see and to show that everything should not go back to normal, because that normal is death. So we need to try other things, and we have the answer. So that's where we will build a bigger we. So thanks a lot to all of the participants that stayed up to this point. We're just getting a 2-minute overtime, so this is perfect. And we'll see you next on our next initiatives. Thank you to all our brilliant and wonderful speakers. And bye-bye. So take care and keep safe. We have a big struggle, many big struggles ahead. Thank you.